All right. Well, for my last class, I stood the whole entire time, and now my legs don't want to work, so I apologize. But I am going to have to write some stuff on the board for you today, and I will do that. I thought that I would just start off with a little bit of a review of how we got to where we got. And I also, a little bit of housekeeping first. I am going to be putting your test up tomorrow. If it is not there by 5, if you do not see the announcement that, hey, this assessment is up there by 5, email me or text me, whatever, because it will be up. So that means there's something wrong. Make sense? And there is an extra little button I have to push in order to make it visible to you, and apparently I don't always catch that, or haven't always in the past. I've gotten better. So let me know if by 5 o'clock it is not there. I will make sure, or if you wake up Saturday morning and check and it's not there, please let me know. All right. The stuff we're talking about today and that we talked about on Tuesday are not going to be on the exam, as you already know, but the stuff prior to it will be. So how did we get to Peter Ramus? So we know that when we started with Aristotle, he said that rhetoric is the art of knowing in a particular instance all the means of persuasion. Right? We know that. And we know that Plato's criticism of rhetoric was that rhetoric it hid the truth, right? It would literally be like lies, in his view. But Aristotle said, no, we need it in order to be able to share what knowledge we get from dialectic, right? So we know that there already was this debate, this tension between rhetoric and dialectic, or rhetoric and philosophy is the way we usually word it. As we move through Cicero and Quintilian, we learn that there's a very important relationship between power and rhetoric, and that both of them had the same view of rhetoric, but had to present it differently. And therein is, in of itself, is a practice in rhetoric, right? The idea that you would know your audience and know how to make your argument the most persuasive. And that's where we're left for a long time, because as we know, during the medieval period, not that much was going on unless it was inside the church, right? We know that St. Augustine found ways to talk to the people in the church, in preaching, in teaching, in converting people, that there was a way to use rhetoric for good, to fight against Satan, all that. And we know that they thought that rhetoric was evil for some very specific reasons, right? Can anybody give me one? Do you remember any of them? Yeah. Yes. Maybe one reason why rhetoric was. What's that? Right. It's not the word of God or to church. Yeah. You think you're better than that, I guess, or you're trying to find something other than that.
The devil and the snake used rhetoric in the Garden of Eden.
Yep. The snake used it in the Garden of Eden, and we need to fight against that. Good. So those are 2 of them. I don't remember how many I gave you. I think like 5. But yeah, those are at least 2 of them. It was a practice by pagans, those people who lived before Christ who clearly should be Christians. That was funny. They're laughing. Okay, so we get to Ramus, and we're coming out of the dark period, the dark ages, but we're not quite there yet. What we do know is that rhetoric, and if you read, you know this, was one of the, at the time, 6 liberal arts. It was key to education. And Ramus was a teacher. He wanted to be a philosopher. He wanted to chair the philosophy department, if you want to look at it that way back then. But they wouldn't let him. And instead appointed him the chair of rhetoric. And he was really not happy with this at all. And the work that we looked at for today is the reasons why Ramus did not like the treatment of rhetoric by Aristotle, by Cicero, by Quintilian. He didn't like it. We're going to talk about each of those today. And if you read, you'll know exactly what's coming. So let's start off with, how did Ramus see rhetoric? How did he define it? What did it look like? According to Ramus, God gave us two gifts. One gift was speech, the other was reason. Now, I don't know if you remember that I mentioned this before, but at the time of the Middle Ages and into the early Renaissances, there was very little distinction between the words reason and science, okay? The reason why there was not a lot of distinction there is because science had not yet moved past the stage of observation, sight, of our five senses. Hadn't really moved past our five senses and then logic going from that, okay? I go outside, I feel the sun on my face, I start to sweat, it's hot outside. That must be a high temperature, right? I'm reasoning out that it's a high temperature. Science, as we think about it, is slightly different from that. For them, that's how it was. Science today and reason are separate, and here's how we might distinguish them. I went outside, the sun is on me, I'm starting to sweat, it must be a high temperature. That would be reason. Looking at a thermostat would be science. Using something else to understand what we're seeing, feeling, hearing, whatever. The process of doing science by the five senses, does anybody know what that's called? No? Okay, it's called empiricism. I'll write it over here. Empiricism is understanding the world through our five senses. Sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste. Now, I'll be honest with you, we have a lot more than five senses. We have a sense of time, a sense of space, a sense of light and dark. All of those are different senses. Because even if you have your eyes closed and you can't see, you can usually tell if it's day or night, or if there's lights on or not, right? So we've got more senses than just the five, but at the time, empiricism would be understanding through your five senses. That would be considered reason or science during Ramus's time. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So God gave us two gifts, speech and reason. And therefore, Ramus said, to ask for the inclusion of speech and reason under the purview of rhetoric is stupid. Literally, almost verbatim. I'm just kidding. That's a paraphrase. But the idea that we would take all of the things that are reason or science and speech and put them together under the term rhetoric was silly. There is a huge difference between speech and reason, according to Ramus. Therefore, what he did was he divided up the five canons between speech and reason. Did any of you catch which of the five canons goes under speech and which one goes under reason? Anybody? Okay. Under reason, he would put invention and arrangement. And depending on which edition or interpretation you read, sometimes memory. Under speech then would be the other three, or the other two. What are the other two? Delivery and style. Good. So under speech, we have delivery and style only. Why is this important? Because that speech section there, that's rhetoric. This here is reason. According to Ramus, the only thing rhetoric should be concerned with is delivery and style, and nothing else. And thus began the great misconception that rhetoric is nothing but empty, flowery language. So it's all Ramus's fault that people say that rhetoric is lying. Rhetoric is a false sense of flowery words and nothing else. That there's no thought behind it. That it doesn't have to be truthful. That it doesn't necessarily represent what we think it represents. So he goes through each of the theorists talking about really why they're wrong. So if you ever saw The Princess Bride, you would have seen the scene where the man in black finds Vizzini, and Vizzini says, have you ever heard of Aristotle, Plato, Socrates? And the man in black says, yes. And he says, morons, or stupid, or I forget what it was he said. I think he said morons. Essentially saying that those three were clueless, and he was smarter than them. Ramus kind of takes the same attitude here and says that he understands the distinction between speech and reason, between rhetoric and reason. And therefore, his interpretation is superior. Now, he is undercutting some of the foundational theorists and some of the foundational theories about how rhetoric works. Nobody liked that. People really were not okay with him trying to take down the basis for almost all philosophy on the planet, at least in the Western Hemisphere. Right? So he says that rhetoric exists as one of the 6 liberal arts, not as a part of every liberal art. I think I told you guys I would get the 7 liberal arts for you, didn't I? Was that in here? Or was that the other class? It was in here. That's what I thought. And I never Googled it. I'm going to Google till I can Google no more. It won't take that long.
Call some morons in the seat. I looked it up on YouTube.
Yeah, morons.
They're all morons.
Morons. I mean, that's a great movie. Okay, so the 7 liberal arts are as follows: grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Now, you don't need to know those. I'm just letting you know that when people say you go to a liberal arts college, that this is what they're talking about, that you learn the core, what we call general ed or core 42 or whatever it is that we call it here. I get very sensitive about this. But you will notice that rhetoric is the 7th out of them, and it's separate from grammar and logic. And Ramus would say that it has to be separate from all of the arts, that it's its own art of speaking, style, and delivery. Whereas others would say that you have to learn rhetoric because it's in all of the arts. It's the basis for all of the arts. Think about this for a minute. If I'm going to convince you that there's a constellation in the sky, do I give you astronomical figures? and numbers and GPS? No, I say there is a picture, and here is how you put a picture on it to see the constellation with the stars. It never makes sense, by the way. Why a bear looks like a giant dipping cup, I don't know. But there you go. I have to explain this to you. I have to practice rhetoric in order to teach you an astronomy lesson. Does that make sense to you? Okay. And that would be true for math, geometry. I don't know why he separates arithmetic and geometry. I don't know what the difference is. I'm sure my aunt, who has like a master's degree in math, would be able to tell me, but I don't know. But they are separated. So according to the 7 liberal arts, rhetoric is its own thing. And it's really a combination of all of the arts. And Ramus is really pissed about this. Sorry. Now, when it comes to Aristotle, Cicero, and Quintilian, Ramus asks a very important question. And the question that he asks is, do we need to treat them all like gods instead of men? He says Cicero probably was the greatest orator of all times. That does not mean he was perfect in not knowing everything. Aristotle was a philosopher, but that does not mean he was perfect in knowing everything. These people are not gods, and he says that we worship them as if they are gods. I don't ever see that, but okay. And he says, do we have to love them all like that? Can they just be men who existed at some point? And then he says, in order to really understand the importance of that question, we must look at the limits of the definitions for rhetoric. So he starts with Aristotle. And of course, Aristotle talks about dialectic and talks about rhetoric and says they are counterpart to each other. And Ramus says this doesn't make any sense. They're two separate things according to Aristotle. We should separate them. Even though Aristotle was saying you can't demonstrate dialectic without practicing rhetoric. Yeah, we're just ignoring that, right? When it comes to Cicero, he says, yes, he was a great speaker. That does not make him knowledgeable on all things. He could be the best speaker to ever exist. All that means is that he's practicing rhetoric, not that he's great in reason. And I think at one point he says in this translation something to the extent of, he may have had a couple of civil wins, meaning like he may have gotten some legislation passed in the Senate, or may have won a political role in the Senate. But that does not mean he was anything more than a great rhetorician. So we're ingraining this idea that just because someone sounds good does not mean we need to give them the credit of being great at reason by defining rhetoric with reason. Finally, with Quintilian. He says the problem with Quintilian's definition of rhetoric is that it's overbroad. It is too all-encompassing. And that Quintilian just lays it out there to make it as encompassing and overbroad as possible, because Quintilian says that a great rhetorician is not just speaking well. He says it's a good person speaking well. And by adding, you have to be a good person who speaks well, Ramus says that's expanding the definition of rhetoric. You should just be able to be a good speaker. And I would suggest, or purport, or contest, or whatever word you want to use here, I would propose I would propose that rhetoric requires for you to be a good person and a good speaker. Being a good orator, a good speaker, only requires you to be a good speaker. Like Quintilian, Aristotle, Cicero said we should not practice speech for the sake of speech. That you need to be saying something that is of import, that is ethically given, that is driven by reason. Ramus really had a problem with this, a big problem. I'm not really sure why he was so damn angry about this. So scholars, he says, need to learn to separate out being a rhetorician from being a dialectician. Okay, this word, to the best of my knowledge, does not come to pass until Ramus invents it. I think what he's trying to say is what Plato said about the distinction between a rhetorician and a philosopher. Philosophers seek to find the truth through the process of dialectic. Rhetoricians seek to hide or change the truth through the practice of rhetoric, of speech. So Ramus is really hearkening back to that same idea that somehow there is a distinction between a dialectician and a rhetorician. Do you want me to write that on the board? Just spell it, okay. Okay, so we've got a dialectician, one who practices dialectic, not dialect, dialectic for the process of reason, versus a rhetorician who Ramus says is just all about style and delivery. And he says in order for scholars to understand rhetoric, we must understand this division. So if you want to understand rhetoric, you need to know how it's different from dialectic and philosophy. In addition, another reason why Ramus says we need to separate these out as scholars is because Quintilian says that dialectic is a virtue. It's a virtuous process. Therefore, so is rhetoric a virtue. And Ramus says that's incorrect. That is a flawed equivalency. Rhetoric is not a virtue, it's an art. Dialectic is a virtue by it being a practice. So what Plato says about dialectic leads to the truth, rhetoric hides the truth, is what Ramus is trying to say here as well. But Quintilian says both of them are virtues. They're both a virtue. And they work together to be virtuous. Now, what do I mean by virtuous? I mean that it's an ethical practice. It's for good moral reason and outcome that we practice rhetoric. So when Quintilian brings in that you must be this good person, you must be a person of ethics in order to be a good speaker, Ramus says that's crap. And you might think, well, that holds up because clearly there's a distinction. And one of the reasons why you think that is because Ramus started a trajectory, a shift in the way that we think about rhetoric. You'll remember our timeline, right? We got the ancient Greeks, the Romans, the Dark Ages, and that gets us up to somewhere, well, let me actually check and see. When did Ramus write? Does anybody have the book open? No. I don't want to misinform you, and I don't know if it was the 14th, 15th, or 16th century. So. Okay. It's the 16th. So 1515 roughly. Okay, so the 16th century, I'm sorry, yeah, the 16th century. Did I do that right? I hate when I get that confused. In the 16th century, we are starting to see, if we're not in, that's wrong. It's not the 1600s. Hello. 16th century, 1500s. In about the 1500s, we start to see this split. Where rhetoric becomes not one practice, but two. And we have this sort of timeline split where rhetoric is only speech in the Ramus tradition, and this other one, this other timeline, if you will, where rhetoric is speech and reason. And what starts to happen is we will note that an entire course of study goes that way and another one goes this way. This one is generally called speech or elocution. What is elocution? Shocker. Hope you're sitting down for this really crazy reasoning. Elocution is the understanding of the practice of speech in style and delivery only. It's the study of nonverbals, of presentation style, not of language used, because that would be reason, but of the eloquence of the words that you use. Now remember, 16th century, you're talking Pride and Prejudice age, roughly. And if you guys remember, I mentioned Pride and Prejudice before in here, yeah? The movie and the book, where writing letters, literally, was considered an art, and if you were skilled at it, that was considered a benefit to you as a woman. So, rhetoric as speech or elocution only, versus those who looked as rhetoric as speech and reason, or philosophy. Rhetoric as a philosophy. Now, I know, again, this is going to be a shocker. This started in the 1500s. This started in the 16th century. We're in the 21st century. So for all of the past 500 years, this split has existed. And it still exists today. And I'll tell you how you can most see it. Rhetoric being a philosophy or a philosophical position, or rhetoric or speech and reason, that definition of rhetoric is usually found in English departments. So there's a rhetoric class in the English department here. That will teach you grammar and reasoning and writing reasoning and writing well and not speaking. Why? Is it because of this? Yeah. Now, we take this all the way up to the 20th century, and this is still being taught as elocution and rhetoric. Two different courses of study. And then the 1960s hit, so mid-century, mid-20th century. And in the mid-20th century, the way that schools were divided, by schools I mean universities, the way the academy was divided, speech and writing were together. But adopting this philosophy that speech should be differentiated from writing, the speech teachers started leaving the English departments. And they started a National Communication Society, which today is known as the National Communication Association. Excuse me. And in creating the National Communication, or the National Speech Society, and then it turns into the National Communication Association. And in doing that, in the mid-20th century, departments in communication developed. No longer did speech teachers have to live in English departments. They now lived in their own department of communication. And through a good portion of the late 20th century, this division between speech and reason that we can thank Ramus for in the 15th century, 16th century, that division was still pretty visible, very visible. Communication departments dealt with speaking. English departments dealt with writing. And what neither of them was willing to acknowledge is that they were both practicing rhetoric. We had different means of communicating that rhetoric. One's writing, one's speaking, but they both were actually doing the things that you're supposed to do in the practice of rhetoric, according to Aristotle, Cicero, and Quintilian. Am I making any sense to you? Okay, good. I am to them. I don't know about you. Okay. So communication departments really started popping up about the 1960s, which I realize to all of you feels like that was a long freaking time ago, Dr. Budash. Why would we care about history? Well, I was born in '74, so I came around just when communication was coming into existence, really. And so by 1994, when I told my father I was switching from English to communication, he was like, oh my God, you're never going to get anywhere with that fly-by-night degree. Because to him, it was such a new idea that he was convinced I would never get a job, ever. When I graduated and I started doing my graduate work, he's like, oh, yeah, I guess you were right. But the problem was that, as I was telling an advisee today, I may have my degree, in political communication and rhetoric. But when I studied it in my undergrad, in my graduate program, and ultimately in my PhD as well, I took almost the same number of credits in English departments as I did in communication departments. That meant, by the way, I was taking extra credits all over the place, just for fun. The reason for that was attempting to understand the relationship or the reasoning of the division between rhetoric as speech and rhetoric as writing. And if you take rhetoric in the English department, it's very different. Let me give you one example. We're going to study a theorist named Kenneth Burke coming up here in a few weeks. And Kenneth Burke was a literary critic who wrote pieces that are considered rhetorical theory now. He's considered a rhetorician, a critic, a rhetorical critic. He wrote two books in his lifetime that are important. One of them is called The Rhetoric of Motives, the other one's called The Grammar of Motives. In the communication department, we teach the rhetoric of motives. In the English department, they teach the grammar of motives. In other words, same theorist, writing about two different modes of communication, really, and two different modes of rhetoric, two different ways. And so one of the things I wanted to do when I was in my PhD program was make sure I understood people like Burke, who said, here's what rhetoric should be like in an English department, and here's what it should be like in a communication department. Because I wanted to understand both of them. And you know what? Ultimately, he's saying sort of the same thing. Because the mode of delivery, speech or writing, has the same rules. The difference is when you're practicing a speech, there is a continuous relationship that you have with your audience. Whereas when you write, you become irrelevant to what is said. So the author is irrelevant, whereas a speaker is part of the message. Does that make sense? So the speaker becomes part of the rhetorical act when there's a speaking situation. The author disappears from that rhetorical act when you're writing. And then from, I want to say about the late 70s, early 80s into the mid 90s, which isn't a long period of time, but there were debates, and I was in college at the time, it's the only reason why I remember this. There were whole debates in scholarly journals about whether or not speaking and writing were the same. What happens when you don't, when you see speaking and writing differently? There was a theorist we used to read. I don't make you guys read it anymore because I don't feel like it's relevant, but there was a theorist who said the author is dead. The death of the author is the name of the book that he wrote. And I'm trying to think, I think it might have been ECO. Anyway, he wrote this as saying essentially that when you put stuff down on paper, the author becomes so irrelevant, they might as well be dead. There is nothing more that you're going to get from that interchange between you and the book, between you and the writing. And another theorist I don't make you read, named Derrida, said, write, because when you have a speaking situation, you have something that intervenes. And that thing that intervenes is what's occurring in the relationship between the speaker and the audience. Okay. I don't know that that justified us splitting into two different departments and academic courses and PhDs or whatever, but that's what happened. And now we sit in this position where, how do I say this politely? I think it happened to speech first, that we stopped caring about the credibility of a message. And in writing, we stopped caring about the credibility of a message around the time that what I call iNews, news that we make and we deliver through social media, that kind of news, that kind of reporting, and that kind of writing really put us into a position where nobody cares about the credibility of the author anymore either. So we're kind of spiraling right now in trying to define whether or not there's a difference between the rhetoric of writing and the rhetoric of speech or not. There is no answer to that right now. We're still confused as a field. Questions so far? Okay. Do we have any idea then why we in the speech departments, the communication departments, have decided that it's important for you to understand rhetoric? I'll word that a different way. Why do we in the communication department want you to understand rhetoric? Sounds like a bunch of boring historical philosophy to me. Why do we do it?
Communication today.
What's that?
It's the base for a lot of communication practices today.
It is the basis for a lot of communication practices today. That is true. Any other reasons why we might make you guys take this incredibly difficult, boring course? To understand the history of what? Persuasion, yes, okay, that's another key word, right? That everything that we communicate, no matter how we communicate it, is persuasive in nature, right? Even if, say for example, in 115, do we still teach you guys to do an informative speech and a persuasive speech? Okay. Think of your informative speech. Does anybody remember what their topic was? What was your topic?
Abortion.
Abortion. How to get one, or?
What it is.
What it is. Okay, so definitional. Okay. So what is abortion? Now, that doesn't sound like a persuasive topic to us, does it? Except you had to choose that topic, decide that it was important enough to give the speech, find the strategy in order to best teach people about that definition, that information that you want to get across to them, and then to deliver that appropriately. In doing so, you determine what information is most important for them to know. You determine what you're going to emphasize and what you're going to de-emphasize. You are choosing for them how much or how little information you're giving them about the topic and every subtopic, right? So in other words, what you're really doing is you're making persuasive choices, right? Now, you don't have to agree with me on that, but I would make the argument that every bit of communication is persuasive in nature. Even when you get directions from IKEA about how to set up your new desk that you just got or your bookshelf, I'm one of those people who's like, screw it, I'll just do it the way it's supposed to look and it'll be fine. And inevitably, it will fall apart. My husband will sit there and go point by point exactly with the instructions, to the extent that the first thing he does is open up all the packages and make sure he has the right numbers of screws and nails and boards and whatever else he needs. Why do his turn out just fine and mine do not? The answer is, they're not just telling you how to build your desk from IKEA. They're telling you the best way to do it to get the end result you want, right? So they are choosing for you the order in which you should do stuff that's going to, in their opinion, best provide for you the instructions you need. Does anybody want to argue with me that there is informative speech that's not persuasive?
scene was just, I might be remembering the wrong speech, but it was just about different camera angles used in The Conjuring.
Okay.
And I straight up just talked about it. I guess it was.
That's actually a good topic.
I had
You guys
fun.
had great
I
topics.
started it with it's the, I don't know if you guys have seen The Conjuring, but it's the scene where like the lady gets dragged by the ghost. I'm like, this is a great way to show different camera scenes, and then someone screaming it and dragged, and then turning it off, going back to my speech. I had fun.
Yeah. But you chose which parts of that film, which segments of that film demonstrated your point, right? What if I came in and I just disagreed with that, right? And I said, nope, what you really want to look at are these timestamps, this scene, this image that demonstrates that camera angle better than the ones you made, right?
Yeah.
So your speech is persuasive. You're saying not just these are the camera angles. You're not just saying that. You're saying these are the camera angles that we know about, and this is the best way to view them, right?
Mhm.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That was a good one though. You almost stumped me for a minute. Anybody else have an example of just pure informational speech or writing? Newspapers attempt to do this. Is anybody in here a journalism major? No. Or, huh?
I was when I first started.
You were? Okay. No? You can't do it? Not anymore. Okay. What was your struggle with journalism?
Mainly my advisor, but also just the industry in general. It was just.
Mainly my advisor.
Well, I never unlocked the door to my building because no one ever comes here. He was in Clay Hall. I've never been in Clay Hall before.
Where the hell is Clay Hall?
No one knew! I'm sorry. I was freshman year trying to figure that out.
Who was this advisor?
Jack Diamond.
Oh, yeah, he's in Stronghold now.
God, idiot. But it was just a lot of, like, 'cause I liked journalism in high school. It was just the level of what you were expected to do and how are you supposed to get that. I just did not agree with that. I don't know.
Okay, makes sense. Journalism, when I was taking it, because I was in a journalism department as well, one that had journalism in it, kind of like ours does now. I had to learn all that crap. I had to write a news story. I had to write an opinion piece. I hated every bit of it. I had to write an obituary. And he assigned us who we had to write the obituary about. And mine was, who's the woman who sings that song, Let's Give Them Something to Talk About, and I Can't Make You Love Me. Darn it. I can picture her, I can't remember her name.
Bonnie Raitt?
Huh? Bonnie Raitt.
Great.
Yeah, that's right. He gave me her, and this was like 1996. And I'm like, who the hell is this person? And you have to remember that this was before the internet. So I couldn't Google her name. I had to go try to dig her out of the encyclopedia. Well, the woman had just started writing. She wasn't in the encyclopedias yet. It was almost impossible to find information about her. Drove me nuts. And I did terribly in that class. What is it about journalism that makes it difficult for people to write? And the answer is that we have convinced ourselves that there is a way to write that is not persuasive. We're wrong, but if you think about it, journalism teaches you to write unbiased, 6th grade level, just the facts, ma'am, kind of writing. And none of us actually do that. And even the great authors, they did it better, but they didn't do that either. You know, when, oh God, who are our guys from Watergate? Really? I can't remember their names. I remember the actors that played them, but I don't remember their names. Okay. Woodward and Bernstein. Okay, considered one of the greatest journalistic duos of all time. They broke the Watergate scandal wide open. even their just the facts ma'am journalism required some level of understanding the meaning of what they were sharing. And if I'm going to determine the meaning of something for you, I'm definitely being persuasive. I'm definitely being biased. If I say the president ordered people to break into the Watergate Hotel to steal Democratic files, I'm saying that it was a bad act. It was illegal. It was wrong. Is it just the facts? Yes, but I'm also putting some sort of judgment on it for you to use in one way or another. So journalistic writing becomes incredibly difficult. And we've started to acknowledge this. We're now like hands off. Clearly this is leaning one way or another. Now, I happen to think that some sources of information are better than others, and some are far worse than others. For example, MSNBC and Fox News, we know they lean. Lean isn't even the right word. They literally dig a hole going the direction they want to go. Okay? But then we have things like PBS, the Associated Press, and those are the only two I could come up with. NPR, that are better about giving you both sides of the story as informationally as possible, all that. They're better about it. But we're not stupid enough to think that there's no opinion in it or no swaying in it, right? We're always writing from a position. I don't remember why I got on that subject, except to say that I believe everything is persuasive. So, did I demonstrate that well enough for you? Did I give you enough evidence? Yeah, some of you are convinced, some of you are not convinced. Most of you don't care. Okay, that's fair, it's fair, it's fair. But yes, one of the reasons why we teach rhetoric is because it requires you to think critically about the messages that you're receiving, which Michael can tell you, even when I'm at a questionable strip show for someone who's getting married or got married. I thought it was a comedy show because it was at the comedy club, but apparently, no, it was a male review. Okay, even sitting at that, all I kept thinking about was, is this okay? What message is this really sending about the state of our society? Should I be trying to take the youngest one home and give him warm milk and pet his head and tell him everything's going to be okay? Or do I continue to let these people sell their looks and their bodies and their dancing? Obviously, it's the latter of those two, but my initial reaction from my position of being a 50-year-old grandmother watching these men dancing up in front of me was very much like, wait a minute, what the hell's going on here? And that's why I think the majority of the rest of the crowd was drunk, because they don't want to think about what is the moral value of this messaging, right? But we require you to question every bit of messaging, which is why going to see a movie with me or a concert or apparently a male review is terrible. I'm the worst person to go with. And this is what I'm turning you into too. You're going to be there, don't worry, it'll take some time, but you'll get there. Why is that important to the study of communication? Well, this means that anytime you write something in PR, for example, a press release of some kind, even announcing a nonprofit, anytime that you are looking at the organizational structure of a corporation and looking at the flow of communication, hierarchically or not, anytime that you are even studying the interpersonal relationships and arguments between two people, you are critically analyzing what is happening. Any research that you do, you're deciding how to do it, what questions to ask, how to answer those questions, as you learn in 210, unfortunately, right? It's all persuasion at that point, but more importantly, it's all relying on you understanding the basis that communication is persuasive. And that it requires a good ethic. Somebody asked me once, what's the difference between communication and rhetoric? And I was like, in my world, nothing. You are responsible for what you create. But to the rest of the world, you know, who don't have all the time to just sit around thinking about this question, or don't get paid to think about this question, I should say. For the rest of the world, communication is literally just talking. Because they don't think about the critical implications of what they're saying, right? And we're trying to teach you guys that there's a responsibility for you to think about that when you study communication. So anytime you're practicing it in your future selves, your future life, whatever you go into, you need to understand the ethics of communication. Unfortunately, that means, thanks to Ramus, I'm pointing at nothing, thanks to Ramus, that means that we have to teach you rhetoric. Make sense? And so you have to read all this boring shit. Sorry, pardon my French. Somebody once asked me too, you teach a rhetoric class, but you swear. Why? This, of course, was someone from the baby boomer generation who believes that being an eloquent speaker means that you never use a vulgar word. And I had to explain to them that times they are a-changing, and that these words are sometimes useful, right? For me, in the beginning, it was just getting the attention of my students, right? Because they would all be half passed out by the time I got to this point in the class. Like, okay, there's only 15 minutes left. She can't go on forever. This is gonna stop soon, right? And then you start falling asleep. That was back in the old days. And I used to say, I don't know, I'd drop an F-bomb or shit or something to get their attention again. You guys, I can't do that with because you're in your computers, and chances are good you're seeing those words anyway. So I'm probably not going to draw your attention with them, but they're so common to you. I mean, do any of you still have my mother still does not ever swear, never uses a vulgar word. In fact, when she gets mad at a car in front of her, her version of road rage is, you dim-dum. That is as far as she goes. Do any of you still practice no swearing, no vulgarity in your language? You all swear and you're all vulgar? So me saying shit doesn't even faze you, does it? What's that?
It makes me giggle.
It makes you giggle?
Shit, and I'm just like...
Well, I'm glad that I'm able to do that. But no kidding, when I first started teaching, and in about 5 years into my teaching, that was considered a huge no-no in the classroom. You never swore when you were in front of the classroom because they felt that it destroyed your credibility. Now it's just part of our thing. It's our jam, right? Like nobody is surprised anymore when I drop, that's bullshit or whatever. And even now I'm still uncomfortable doing it, but I practice it anyway. So what do we know? We know that Ramus came along and said that there is a separation between rhetoric and reason, that he relies on his critiques of Aristotle, Quintilian, and Cicero to explain how that happens. He relies on his own credibility to say, we need to keep them separated. That's the only way that we can function in education. Did anybody happen to read how Ramus died? I believe it was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. He was pretty much literally, from what I understand, run out of town on rails. And Do you guys know what that means? Okay, that's funny. It's one of those things that I grew up saying, like, I'm gonna run you out of town on the rails, man. Way back when we had trains as our major form of mass transportation for long distances, they ran on rails and they went really fast, right? So when we said we're gonna run you out of town on rails, that means it's gonna be fast and it's gonna be brutal, right? And he ended up dying from the attack that he got during that massacre. And some people were just like, as he should. And I'm like, that's not okay. That's not a nice thing to say. That's not ethical. But he was run out of the academy multiple times. He was told that he could not teach what he wanted to teach. He had to teach what they told him to teach. And they ran him out of town once or twice. All because of his views on rhetoric and trying to reject the foundational principle that rhetoric, it has to be ethical. Literally, that's what he was pissed about. I don't know why. I don't know what to tell you. Okay, what questions do we have about Ramus? Okay, do we have any questions about the exam that you're gonna see tomorrow pop up? Okay. Questions, comments, concerns, complaints, or threats at this time? Yes,
Is it going from tomorrow till next Friday?
correct.
Okay, sick.
Yeah, 7 full days. And so if I get it up by 5 tomorrow, it will be due at 11:59 next Friday. If you don't see it for some reason and I can't get it up until Saturday morning because of some fluke, then it will go until Saturday morning of the following week. Does that make sense? You'll have 7 days no matter what. Anything else? Okay, then we'll wrap up here for today. Thank you for your attention and your participation. I appreciate it.